It was a regular Thursday morning when Jamal walked into the downtown bank, completely unaware that his day was about to take an unexpected and humiliating turn. He had come to handle some routine business, a simple transaction that should have taken no more than a few minutes. What he didn't expect, however, was the cold, dismissive attitude of the bank manager, Mr. Cooper. Jamal was no stranger to the occasional judgmental stare, but today felt different. As he approached the counter, Mr. Cooper, a man who looked as if he'd spent his whole life behind a polished desk, barely looked up. When he did, it wasn't the friendly professional smile Jamal was used to seeing in customer service. No, it was a tight-lipped grin, one that seemed forced and insincere, almost as if he was trying to hide something darker. "How can I help you today?" Mr. Cooper's voice was flat, his eyes flickering over Jamal in a way that made him feel less than human. It was subtle at first, but it didn't take long for Jamal to catch the undertones in his words. The way he hesitated, as if Jamal's very presence was an inconvenience, or worse, a threat. He brushed off Jamal's request for a simple banking service, his words laced with a condescending tone that made Jamal feel small. "I don't think you understand," Mr. Cooper said after Jamal mentioned his request. "This is a serious matter. I don't think you have the credentials to be asking for this type of service." Jamal stood frozen, taken aback by the words, his face burning with frustration. It wasn't the first time he had encountered racism in his life, but something about this moment was different. The way Mr. Cooper spoke to him felt deliberate. It wasn't just about the request Jamal made. It was about who Jamal was, where he came from, and the color of his skin. Jamal tried to keep his cool, but the humiliation was palpable. He had experienced injustice before, but this moment felt like something more, a personal attack. He had always prided himself on handling things with grace, but today he felt as though he was being treated as inferior. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Mr. Cooper finally dismissed him with a wave of his hand, a look of irritation crossing his face. "I don't think we can help you today, Mr. Williams," he said, the words dripping with a venomous undertone. Jamal left the bank that day feeling defeated. The sting of Mr. Cooper's words burned deep, and the weight of the humiliation stayed with him as he walked down the street. It wasn't just the way he was treated that bothered him, it was the injustice of it all. How many times had he been made to feel small because of the color of his skin? How many times had people like Mr. Cooper decided his worth without even knowing him? It was a feeling that Jamal couldn't shake. He had to do something about it. He had to make sure that no one ever treated him or anyone else that way again. The next day, Jamal was back in that same bank, but this time he wasn't alone. He had a plan, a quiet determination in his eyes, and a desire for justice that burned hotter than ever. What Mr. Cooper didn't know was that Jamal wasn't the same man he had humiliated the day before. No, Jamal had learned from the past, and now he was ready to turn the tables. As Jamal approached the counter, the bank manager looked up, his face still bearing that same smug, dismissive look. But today, it would be different. Jamal could feel the power shift in the air. Something was about to change, something big. But as he stepped forward, ready to put his plan into action, he noticed something that made his heart race. A small detail, one that could change everything. Mr. Cooper wasn't just the arrogant manager he thought he was. There was something more to him. Something that would lead to a shocking twist Jamal never saw coming. What was it that Jamal had discovered? Would he finally get the justice he deserved, or would this be another moment of defeat? Tune in next time to find out, because the story isn't over yet. The revenge Jamal had been planning was just the beginning. The moment Jamal stepped into the bank the next day, he felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just the cold air blasting from the overhead vents, or the dull hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It was the feeling that something was about to happen, something important. His heart beat faster with each step as he approached the counter. Mr. Cooper, sitting behind the polished desk, was still staring at a computer screen, his expression unreadable. Jamal had spent the last few hours going over his plan in his head. He wasn't just here to settle a score with the bank manager. No, this was about something bigger. This was about standing up to years of frustration and injustice, about proving that he wasn't just going to sit back and let people like Mr. Cooper walk all over him. The incident from the day before had stirred something deep inside Jamal. He was no longer going to be passive, no longer going to let others define him. He had learned the hard way that silence, that following the rules, didn't always work in a world where bias ran deep. So this time, he was going to do things differently. But there was something Jamal wasn't expecting. As he walked toward the counter, something felt off, almost like a ripple in the air. Mr. Cooper didn't look up. His fingers tapped the desk nervously, a small, barely noticeable sign of discomfort. Jamal stood still for a moment, watching him. The bank manager's usual coldness seemed to have softened, though just by a fraction. It was a change, but Jamal didn't know whether it was a good sign or just an illusion. He cleared his throat, trying to catch the manager's attention. "Mr. Cooper," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge of resolve. "I'm here for the business I was supposed to handle yesterday. You know what I mean." Mr. Cooper glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. The fake smile from the previous day was gone, replaced by a hint of annoyance, though there was something else beneath it, something that made Jamal uneasy. "Oh, you're back, Mr. Williams," he said with a sharpness that didn't quite mask the tension in his voice. "I thought you'd be gone by now." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "I wasn't finished," he said simply. The manager hesitated for a moment, looking at Jamal as if he were weighing his options. Finally, with a sigh, he gestured toward the counter. "Fine. What is it that you need?" Jamal pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket, proof of his rightful claim to the transaction he had asked for the day before. He set it down on the counter with deliberate care, making sure Mr. Cooper couldn't ignore it. "I'm requesting the loan I asked for yesterday," Jamal said, keeping his voice even. He wasn't going to let the man intimidate him again. Mr. Cooper took the paper, but instead of looking at it right away, he glanced up at Jamal, his eyes narrowing further. "You think you're entitled to this?" The question struck Jamal like a slap. He had been bracing for a difficult conversation, but this was something else entirely. The way Mr. Cooper spoke, so certain, so dismissive, made it clear that he didn't believe Jamal deserved this loan, let alone the respect that should come with it. Jamal forced himself to stay calm. He had come prepared for this moment, just like he had come prepared for the fight that was about to unfold. His mind raced, trying to think of the best way to handle this. He had done the research, gathered the evidence, and had more than enough proof to show that he was in the right. But the question lingered in the air, thick with implication. "Why are you asking me that?" Jamal finally said, voice quiet but steady. "You know the answer." Mr. Cooper stiffened. For a second, there was an uncomfortable silence between them, the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air. Then, in a move that surprised Jamal, the manager leaned back in his chair, as if he were considering something far more serious than the request in front of him. "I'm not sure this is going to work out, Mr. Williams," he said, his tone low and cold. "People like you don't typically qualify for loans like this." The words stung, and for a moment, Jamal could feel the old anger bubbling up inside him. But he didn't let it show. He couldn't let it. He had learned that reacting impulsively only made things worse. Instead, he stared at Mr. Cooper, willing himself to stay composed, to remain the man in control of the situation. Jamal's mind raced, trying to find the right words to counteract the insult, to expose the bias that was clearly motivating the bank manager's actions. This wasn't just a bad experience with customer service. This was racism, plain and simple, and Jamal knew he wasn't the only one who had experienced it. He had seen it in his own community, felt it in the way people sometimes looked at him as though he didn't belong, as though he didn't deserve what others took for granted. But now this was personal. The rage that had been simmering inside him since yesterday's humiliation had finally found its voice. He wasn't just going to walk away, not this time. "Is this how you treat everyone?" Jamal asked, his voice sharper now, every word laced with the weight of his frustration. Or is it just me you have a problem with? Mr. Cooper's eyes flickered with something that almost resembled guilt, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. He cleared his throat, glancing briefly at the other bank employees who had been watching the exchange from a distance. The tension in the room was growing, and Jamal could feel it like a pressure in the air. "I suggest you leave, Mr. Williams," Mr. Cooper said, his voice cold again, but there was an edge to it. Jamal stood there, frozen for a moment. He didn't want to leave. Not without doing something, not without taking action, but he knew there was only so much he could do in the moment. The humiliation was palpable, but he couldn't let it control him. He had a plan, and he wasn't about to let Mr. Cooper win. As Jamal turned to walk away, something caught his eye. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A small, neatly folded piece of paper sticking out from under the edge of the desk. Something about it made Jamal pause. His instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cool surface. Just as his hand closed around it, the manager's voice stopped him in his tracks. "I told you to leave," Mr. Cooper said, his voice low and menacing. Jamal ignored him. There was something on that piece of paper, something that could change everything. What could it be? Why was Mr. Cooper so intent on getting Jamal out of there? What was it that the manager was hiding? The answers were just out of reach, and Jamal knew that he had to find out. The tension between them had only just begun. Jamal stood frozen for a moment, his fingers still gripping the small piece of paper hidden beneath the edge of the desk. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly withdrew it, keeping his movements deliberate. He glanced back at Mr. Cooper, who was now watching him with narrowed eyes, his face flushed with anger. Jamal could see the tension in his posture, the way his knuckles whitened around the armrests of his chair. "You don't want to do this, Mr. Williams," the manager warned, his voice low, barely containing the threat. Jamal ignored him, his gaze fixed on the folded paper in his hand. What was this? What could it possibly mean? Without saying a word, he unfolded it. His eyes quickly scanned the message, and his breath caught in his throat. The paper contained a single sentence, typed neatly in black ink. "You don't belong here. You never will. Asterisk." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face as the reality of what he was reading settled in. This wasn't just an insult or a biased decision from Mr. Cooper. This was something deeper. The words were personal, directed at him, not just as a customer, but as a person. And yet, Jamal couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. At least now he understood. The bank manager's coldness, his condescending tone, all of it had been part of a larger scheme, an attitude that went far beyond the confines of their transaction. Jamal's hands trembled as he folded the paper back up, his mind racing. He needed answers. There was no way he could just walk away after this. But even as he stood there, the weight of Mr. Cooper's gaze bore down on him. Jamal felt trapped, as though any wrong move would escalate the situation beyond his control. He stepped back from the counter, eyes still locked on Mr. Cooper, who was now standing, leaning over the desk with his fists clenched. There was no mistaking the rage in his eyes. This wasn't just about a loan or a simple exchange anymore. Jamal had unknowingly stepped into something far more dangerous. "Give me that paper," Mr. Cooper demanded, his voice now rising in anger. Jamal hesitated, considering his options. He could confront the manager directly, accuse him of whatever was going on behind the scenes, but that might make things worse. There was too much at stake. No, he needed a plan. He needed to get out of here first, think through everything, then come back with the evidence to expose whatever twisted agenda Mr. Cooper was hiding. Slowly, Jamal tucked the paper into his jacket pocket, his face betraying nothing. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice cold. "But I'll be back. You haven't heard the last of this." Mr. Cooper's lip curled in disdain. "You're making a mistake, Williams. This is bigger than you realize." Jamal didn't wait for another word. He turned on his heel and walked out of the bank, the sound of the door's chime ringing in his ears like the final bell of a fight. But even as he stepped into the sunlight, he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. There was more to this than he could see. As Jamal walked away from the building, his thoughts were racing. What did Mr. Cooper mean? What was this really about? The deeper Jamal thought, the more unsettling it became. He had spent his entire life pushing forward, doing everything by the book, striving for success in a world that seemed to constantly push back. And now this blatant display of discrimination was a reminder of how deep the roots of bias ran. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and Jamal pulled it out, thankful for the distraction. It was a message from his best friend, Marcus, who had been checking in on him after hearing about the incident at the bank. Jamal's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he began typing a response. "I need help. Something's off with the bank manager. It's not just about the loan. I don't know what's going on, but I need to find out. I'll keep you posted. Asterisk." Jamal hit send, then paused to look around. He needed to clear his head. The weight of everything, of years of microaggressions, subtle and overt racism, and now this was suffocating. He'd been so focused on getting what he deserved from the bank, he hadn't even realized how much the larger system was working against him. As he made his way to a nearby coffee shop, his thoughts kept swirling back to the message on the paper. Was it possible that this was all personal for Mr. Cooper? Was he targeting Jamal because of who he was, or was there something else going on behind the scenes? Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far bigger than just an isolated incident of discrimination. Later that afternoon, Jamal met up with Marcus at a nearby park. His friend was eager to hear about what had happened, but Jamal knew that talking about it wouldn't be enough. He needed action, and Marcus was the one person he could trust to help him figure out what was really going on. They sat down on a bench, the weight of the situation still heavy in the air between them. Jamal pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to Marcus without a word. His friend unfolded it slowly, reading the message in silence. "This is intense," Marcus said, his voice low. "Who would write something like this? And why would Mr. Cooper have it?" "I don't know," Jamal replied, running a hand through his hair. "But it's personal, and it's not just about the loan. This is bigger than that. I've seen this kind of thing before, people in power trying to keep us down, make us feel like we don't belong. But this feels like something else." Marcus stared at the paper for a long moment, his face thoughtful. "You think it's more than just a racist thing? That there's something deeper going on here?" Jamal nodded, his mind working furiously to piece together the puzzle. "I do. There's a reason Mr. Cooper acted the way he did, and I think it has to do with more than just me being here. This is something personal for him, something he's hiding. I'm going to find out what." "But how?" Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk back into that bank and confront him again?" Jamal hesitated. He knew Marcus had a point. Going back to the bank was dangerous. But he also knew that if he didn't, Mr. Cooper would keep on getting away with whatever he was doing. "I'm going to figure out what he's hiding," Jamal said, his voice firm. "And when I do, he'll regret the day he crossed me." The resolve in Jamal's voice was clear, but so was the uncertainty. He was about to step into unknown territory, one where the stakes were higher than anything he faced before, and as he and Marcus sat there, planning their next steps, the sense of urgency only grew stronger. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something far more dangerous than Jamal could have imagined, but he wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth, no matter what it cost him. The days that followed felt like an endless waiting game for Jamal. Each passing hour seemed to stretch on, his mind constantly returning to the question that gnawed at him. What was Mr. Cooper hiding? The more he thought about it, the more his instincts screamed that this wasn't just a personal grudge. It was something deeper. Something that had been brewing for far too long. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Even when he was out in public, walking through the city, Jamal felt like someone was always just a step behind him, ready to strike. It wasn't paranoia. He had learned to trust his gut over the years, and it was telling him that there was a storm coming. Marcus was just as determined to uncover the truth. They spent hours together, gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of the bank manager's life, trying to find a lead that would explain the strange, hostile atmosphere Jamal had encountered. They even went as far as digging into the bank's history, uncovering some troubling stories about its management, rumors of shady practices, unfair loan rejections, and employees who had mysteriously disappeared. All of it seemed to point back to Mr. Cooper, but nothing concrete enough to expose him yet. But Jamal wasn't one to back down. Every clue, every piece of information he uncovered, only fueled his determination to confront Mr. Cooper head-on. It was the morning of the 5th day since their last encounter at the bank when Jamal received an unexpected message. It was a simple text from an unknown number. Asterisk, you're getting too close. Stop now, or it won't end well. Asterisk, Jamal stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. His stomach churned with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He showed the message to Marcus, who looked equally disturbed. We knew it was bad, but this is getting dangerous. Maybe we should back off. Go to the police or something. But Jamal shook his head. No, this is bigger than that. If we don't find out what's really going on, this won't just be about me. It'll be about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly, pushed to the side, forgotten. His voice had a hardness to it, a conviction that Marcus hadn't seen before. That afternoon, Jamal decided he would confront Mr. Cooper once again. But this time, it wouldn't be the same. This time, he would go prepared. He wasn't just walking into that bank to demand answers. No, he was going in with evidence, with a plan to expose the manager for everything he had been hiding, even if it meant risking everything. He had no idea what he was walking into, but the closer he got to the bank, the more his heart raced. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of his decision was pulling him down. The doors of the bank slid open, and the familiar sound of the chime echoed through the air. It was like stepping into a different world, one where nothing made sense, and yet everything was about to change. Jamal made his way to the counter, where Mr. Cooper was standing, as always, behind his polished desk. He didn't even look up when Jamal approached. The bank manager was on the phone, his voice low and urgent. But Jamal didn't care. He wasn't here to wait around. This was his moment. Mr. Cooper, Jamal said, his voice clear and unwavering. The manager glanced up, his expression hardening as soon as he saw who it was. You again, he muttered under his breath. But there was something else there, something Jamal couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. It was fleeting, but it was there. I need answers, Jamal said, pulling out the documents he had gathered, the files he had collected that revealed the truth about the bank's practices. You've been hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is. Mr. Cooper's face tightened, and for a brief moment, Jamal saw something flicker in his eyes, a flash of panic that was gone as quickly as it had appeared. It was then that Jamal realized he was onto something big. You don't know what you're dealing with, Mr. Cooper said, his voice strained. You don't understand how far this goes. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. I understand more than you think, and you're not going to get away with it. But just as Jamal was about to say more, the door to the back office opened, and a tall man in a suit stepped out, his eyes locked on Jamal. He had an air of authority about him, the kind of presence that immediately made Jamal feel like he was in over his head. Mr. Cooper turned to the man, his face draining of color. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice trembling. The man in the suit didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to Jamal, his gaze sharp. I think it's time you left, he said coldly. Before things get complicated. Jamal stood his ground. Not until I get the truth. What's really going on here? Who are you, and what does Mr. Cooper have to do with all of this? The man in the suit stepped closer, his presence intimidating. I think you've been asking the wrong questions, Jamal. This isn't just about you. It's about something much bigger than you'll ever understand. His voice was smooth, almost calm, but there was an undercurrent of menace in his tone. Jamal's mind raced. Who was this man? And what did he mean by that? He could feel the walls closing in around him. He wasn't prepared for this. This was a fight that was no longer just about a loan or a racist bank manager. This was about something far more dangerous. Leave now, the man in the suit repeated, his tone turning harsher. Or you'll regret it. Jamal stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it, the point of no return. He had come this far, and he couldn't back down now. The truth was within his grasp, but what was it going to cost him? He knew he had a choice. Walk away and let things go, or dig deeper and risk it all. And yet, as he stood there, the weight of the decision pressing down on him, he realized there was no turning back. The confrontation was inevitable, and the storm he had been dreading was finally here. But the question lingered in the air: who were these people? What had Jamal stumbled upon? And would he be able to survive the consequences of his pursuit of the truth? Jamal stood still, his heart pounding, as the man in the suit towered over him. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment he wondered if he had made a mistake by coming here. But then he reminded himself why he was there. This wasn't just about some loan rejection anymore. This was about exposing something much bigger. A web of lies, manipulation, and possibly corruption. As the man in the suit moved even closer, Jamal's eyes flicked toward Mr. Cooper, who was now visibly sweating. The bank manager was nervously tapping his fingers on the edge of the desk, his eyes darting back and forth between the man in the suit and Jamal. There was a palpable fear in the air, one that Jamal could feel pressing down on him like a weight. "You don't know what you're getting into," the man in the suit said again, his voice colder now, like a warning. But just as Jamal opened his mouth to retort, a familiar voice interrupted the tense standoff. "Jamal, what are you doing here?" It was Marcus. Jamal's eyes widened as he turned to see his best friend standing in the doorway of the bank, a look of disbelief on his face. He hadn't expected Marcus to show up here, not like this. The last thing he wanted was for his friend to get caught up in whatever was going on. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" Jamal asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "I was worried about you," Marcus said, his gaze shifting to the man in the suit. He wasn't fooled by the intimidating posture. "I got your message, but I didn't know you were planning on confronting these guys. What's going on?" Before Jamal could respond, the man in the suit shot a sharp glance at Marcus. His lips curled into a thin, almost predatory smile. "You brought a friend with you." The man's tone dripped with condescension. "You really have no idea what you're messing with, do you?" Jamal's stomach dropped. The way the man looked at Marcus was unsettling, like a predator sizing up his next victim. Jamal had underestimated how dangerous this situation had become, but that wasn't the worst part. Without warning, the man in the suit pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen with practiced speed. For a moment, Jamal didn't understand what was happening. But then the man looked up at them both, a cold grin spreading across his face. "I'd suggest you both leave now," the man said, his voice sharp and final. "But you're not going to want to be in the city for much longer." Jamal's blood ran cold. There was something about the way he said that, the chilling certainty in his voice, that made Jamal's instincts scream. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew it wasn't good. His eyes darted toward Marcus, whose expression had shifted from concern to something darker, a mix of realization and fear. Suddenly, Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't want to check it, didn't want to be distracted by anything. But the buzzing persisted, growing more urgent. He pulled it out, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the screen. What he saw made his blood run even colder. There on the screen was a message from an unknown number. Asterisk, "Get out of the bank. We're watching you." Asterisk. The words felt like a slap to the face, sending a wave of panic through Jamal's chest. Someone was tracking him. Someone had been watching him long before he ever walked into the bank today. The implications hit him hard. The walls weren't just closing in, they were closing in from all sides. Jamal looked up, locking eyes with the man in the suit, who was watching him with a sinister calm. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one Jamal wasn't ready to confront. This wasn't just about a racist bank manager. This was about something far more insidious, something that reached further than Jamal could see. Before he could react, the bank doors burst open once again, and two more men in dark suits entered, their presence immediately filling the space. The tension in the room escalated, and Jamal's pulse quickened as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. The first man, the one who had been speaking to Jamal, looked at the newcomers and nodded curtly. Without saying another word, he turned to face Jamal. "This is your last chance," he said, his voice growing colder. "You can walk away now, and we'll forget you ever came here. But if you keep digging, if you keep pushing, you'll regret it." Jamal's thoughts were racing, his mind trying to grasp at any solution, any way out of this mess. But the words of the man in the suit hung in the air like an impending storm. "You'll regret it." The warning was clear, but Jamal couldn't back down now. He had already come too far. "Why don't you tell me what's really going on?" Jamal demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Who are you people? What are you hiding?" The man's eyes darkened, and for a split second, Jamal thought he might finally get the answers he'd been seeking. But instead, the man just smiled, a smile that made Jamal's skin crawl. "You don't want to know, Jamal. Trust me, some things are better left in the dark." And then, without another word, the man signaled for the two newcomers to approach. One of them grabbed Jamal by the arm, his grip like iron, pulling him toward the door. Marcus tried to intervene, but the second man effortlessly pushed him aside, sending him stumbling backward. Jamal's mind raced as he was dragged out of the bank, the cold air hitting his face as the door slammed shut behind him. He glanced around in panic, looking for any sign of help, but the street was eerily quiet. He didn't know where they were taking him. He didn't know how deep this went, but he knew one thing for certain: he was in over his head. The city, the streets, everything around him felt like a trap now. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide more danger. He had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, but one thing was crystal clear: his life was in danger. And unless he figured out how to break free, he was going to find himself in the fight of his life. The last thing he saw before the darkness of the alley swallowed him up was the man in the suit, watching from the bank's window, a look of cold satisfaction on his face. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to break free from the grip of the two men. There was no turning back now. The real battle was about to begin, and Jamal had no idea just how far it would take him, or how much he would lose along the way. Jamal's heart raced as he was dragged through the alley, the cold air biting at his skin. The men on either side of him were unrelenting, their grip on his arms tight, ensuring he couldn't break free. His mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had happened. The bank manager, Mr. Cooper, the man in the suit, the strange text messages. Everything had led to this moment, and he was starting to realize just how much he didn't understand. They shoved him into a black SUV parked at the end of the alley, its windows tinted so dark that he couldn't make out who was inside. As they slammed the door shut, Jamal felt the weight of the situation settle in. This wasn't just about a racist encounter at a bank anymore. It wasn't even about exposing a corrupt manager. This was something much bigger, something Jamal wasn't ready to face. The SUV roared to life, its engine vibrating through the metal beneath him as they sped through the streets. Jamal kept his eyes locked on the window, his mind racing. He needed to think. He needed a way out. After what felt like an eternity, the car came to a halt. The two men pulled him out of the vehicle with ease, ignoring his resistance, and led him into a building that looked more like an abandoned warehouse than anything else. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete floor. It felt cold, sterile, dangerous. They didn't say a word as they shoved him into a small room, its walls bare and unwelcoming. The door slammed shut behind him, and Jamal was left alone, the sound of his heartbeat the only thing he could hear. He paced the room, thinking furiously. What did these people want from him? And why had they gone to such lengths to stop him? He had uncovered something, he was sure of it. The pieces were all there, scattered in his mind, but the bigger picture was still out of reach. He had no idea who these people were, or how deep their connections ran, but it was clear now. They would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. And then the door opened. A figure stepped into the room, their silhouette casting a long shadow across the floor. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as the figure moved closer, the fluorescent lights illuminating their face. It was the man in the suit, but now there was something different about him. He wasn't just a mysterious figure in a dark suit. He was someone Jamal recognized. Jamal's hands clenched into fists. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. His father's disappearance, the bank, the threats. It was all connected. This was bigger than he ever imagined. He had been fighting not just for justice for himself, but for everything his father had tried to uncover. But then, just as Jamal was about to speak, the door burst open again. This time, it wasn't just Jameson who entered the room. It was a group of people, more than he could count, all wearing similar dark suits. And among them was Mr. Cooper, the bank manager, looking more nervous than ever. And then the final twist. Behind the group, a familiar face appeared. It was Marcus. But this wasn't the Marcus Jamal knew. His eyes were cold, calculating. He stepped forward, his expression empty. "Marcus," Jamal whispered, his voice barely a breath. "What? What is this?" Marcus looked at him, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You didn't really think I was your friend, did you, Jamal? You've been so busy chasing answers, you never once wondered why I was always there. You've been part of this from the beginning." Jamal's mind exploded in confusion, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place in an instant. Marcus had been playing him all along. He had been feeding information to the very people who were behind everything. His closest ally, his best friend, was a part of this web of deception, of corruption. Jamal felt his world shatter as the truth hit him full force. He had been used, played, and now he was trapped. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in. There was no way out, not this time. The final words from Jameson echoed in his ears as the darkness closed around him. "Welcome to the real world, Jamal. You've just become part of the game." Jamal's world spun, and the room seemed to blur around him as he processed the staggering revelation. Marcus, the man he trusted more than anyone, was not just another victim of the system. He was part of it. Everything that Jamal had fought for, every step he had taken to uncover the truth, had been part of a much larger, twisted game. And now, as the full weight of the situation hit him, he couldn't help but feel betrayed in the deepest way possible. But the betrayal wasn't over yet. Marcus, standing coldly in the back with the others, met his eyes with a distant gaze. It wasn't the face of a friend, but of someone who had completely turned his back. Jamal's heart sank as the reality of his situation became clearer. Marcus had been playing both sides, feeding information to the very people who had taken his father and were now pulling the strings on his own life. Jamal could barely find his voice. "Why, Marcus? Why did you do this to me? To us?" His words trembled, a mix of anger, confusion, and hurt. "We've been through so much together. How could you?" Marcus stepped forward, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, Jamal thought maybe there was still a flicker of the old Marcus, the friend he used to know. But that illusion shattered as Marcus spoke. "You never understood, did you? It was never about friendship, Jamal. It was about survival. I wasn't trying to destroy you. I was trying to protect myself. You should have known better than to think you could take them down. They're too powerful for someone like you." Jamal clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up inside him. The betrayal stung deeper than anything he had ever felt. But beneath it all, there was still one burning question. Why had Marcus done this? What had they promised him that made him turn against Jamal, turn against everything they'd fought for. Before he could voice the question, Jameson stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Enough with the theatrics," he said coldly. "Marcus did what needed to be done. He's part of the bigger picture now. You never had the full view, Jamal. You were always just a pawn in a game much larger than you could comprehend." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. "What is this all about? Why my father? Why me?" Jameson sighed, his eyes narrowing with a mix of irritation and pity. "Your father was a problem. He started asking questions. He uncovered things he wasn't supposed to. And now you've made the same mistake. The system works as it does for a reason. People like us, we keep it running. We protect the system. Your father had to be eliminated because he was a loose end. You, Jamal, you were never meant to dig deeper." Jamal felt the weight of those words sink in. His father hadn't just disappeared. He had been erased for being too curious. Jamal's own investigation had been a dangerous misstep, a step too far into a world that was far darker than he had ever realized. But in that moment, Jamal made a decision. He wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. With a sudden, unexpected rush of strength, Jamal lunged toward the door, slamming his shoulder into the cold metal. The guards weren't quick enough to react as he pushed past them, knocking one off balance and sending the other stumbling backward. He dashed into the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he couldn't stop now. He rounded a corner and found himself face to face with an open stairwell leading upward. Without thinking, he took the stairs two at a time, ignoring the voices and footsteps behind him. Every instinct in his body screamed to run, to escape whatever web they had ensnared him in. And as he reached the top of the stairs, he burst through a door into what appeared to be a small office. For a split second, Jamal hesitated. There was a desk in the middle of the room, papers scattered around, a computer monitor glowing faintly in the dim light. He had no idea what he was looking for, but he knew he needed something, anything, that could help him break free from this nightmare. He moved quickly, searching through the desk drawers, ignoring the growing sound of footsteps and shouts from below. His fingers brushed over a small, sealed envelope hidden under a stack of files. It was addressed to Mr. Cooper in neat handwriting. His pulse quickened as he ripped it open, scanning the contents. The letter was brief, but it was enough to make Jamal's blood run cold. It outlined the payments and instructions for silencing his father. It named names. It showed how deeply the corruption ran, not just through the bank, but throughout the city. This wasn't just a few bad people. This was an entire system built on control, on silencing anyone who threatened their power. Jamal's mind raced. He had the evidence, the proof, but he couldn't stay here. He needed to get out, get this to the authorities, and bring the whole operation down. He grabbed the envelope, shoving it into his jacket pocket, just as he heard the door to the office creak open behind him. In a flash, he turned, ready to fight or flee, but he froze as he saw Marcus standing there. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Jamal pause. "You're making a mistake, Jamal," Marcus said softly, his voice devoid of the emotion it once held. "You can't take them down. They're too powerful." "I don't care," Jamal shot back, his voice firm. "I'm not walking away this time. Not when I have the truth." For a moment, Marcus just stared at him, the tension thick in the air. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jamal standing there with nothing but the weight of the decision he had made. Jamal knew the road ahead would be difficult. The enemies he had made in this battle were powerful, and they wouldn't let him go easily. But now he had something they couldn't take away, the truth. And with that, Jamal would fight for justice, no matter the cost. He ran out of the building, the cold night air hitting him as he disappeared into the streets. His mind was focused on one thing, bringing everything to light. But there was one thing he didn't realize yet. The game wasn't over. He had won a battle, but the war was far from finished. As he disappeared into the darkness, Jamal knew that, for the first time in a long while, he was no longer a pawn. He was in control, and he would fight to the very end.